The Valorian Galactic Empire had ruled 1,000 star systems for 10,000 years, and in all that time, they had never once considered that their reign might end. Were tall beings with skin like polished silver and eyes that glowed with cold purple light. And they believed themselves to be the greatest species the universe had ever created. Every other race existed only to serve them or to be ignored. And most were simply crushed beneath the weight of Valorian boots. Without a second thought, humans were one of those ignored species. They had only been traveling among the stars for 200 years. Which was nothing compared to the ancient Valorian civilization. The Empire had noted their existence in some database somewhere and classified them as primitive but harmless, and then forgotten about them entirely. This suited humanity just fine. Or so the Valorians believed. On the edge of known space, there was a small human colony called New Eden, where farmers grew wheat under an orange sun and children played in fields that stretched toward distant mountains. It was a peaceful place, far from the politics of empires and the wars of greater powers. And the people there wanted nothing more than to live simple lives. Among those people was a family named Chun Marcus. Chun had once been a military engineer for Earth's defense forces, but he had left that life behind to raise his daughter in peace. His wife had died during the colony's founding years from a sickness that swept through the early settlements, and so Marcus had raised his daughter. Lily alone. She was 8 years old, with black hair that her father tied into braids each morning, and a smile that could brighten the darkest room. Lily loved 3 things more than anything else in the world: her father, her dog named Biscuit, and the endless wheat fields where she could run until her legs grew tired. She did not know about the Valorian Empire or the dangers that lurked among the stars. She only knew that the universe was big and beautiful and full of wonderful things, waiting to be discovered on the day that changed everything. The sky above New Eden filled with ships. A Valorian patrol had arrived to conduct what they called an unregistered resources audit, which was really just a fancy way of saying they would take whatever they wanted and punish anyone who complained. Commander Zorvax Keth led the patrol, and he was exactly the kind of Valorian that gave the Empire its terrible reputation. He was cruel and proud, and believed that lesser species existed only to kneel before beings like himself. His soldiers spread across the colony, taking food and equipment and anything else that caught their eye, while the human colonists stood in silence with their heads bowed. They knew better than to resist. Marcus was in town when the patrol arrived, trying to negotiate with the Valorian officers to leave his neighbors with enough supplies to survive the coming winter. He did not know that Lily had wandered away from home. She had been chasing Biscuit through the wheat fields, laughing as the golden stalks brushed against her arms, when she stumbled upon Commander Keth and 3 of his soldiers standing at the edge of a farm. The commander was examining a piece of farming equipment with obvious disgust, muttering about the primitive technology these humans used. Lily stopped running and stared at the tall silver beings with wide, curious eyes. She had never seen aliens before, and she did not understand that she was supposed to be afraid. Biscuit barked once and hid behind her legs. But Lily took a step forward with all the innocent courage that only children possess. "Are you lost?" she asked in her small, clear voice. Looking directly into Commander Keth's glowing purple eyes, the soldiers around him went completely still. In Valorian culture, a lesser being speaking directly to a superior without permission was one of the greatest insults imaginable. And looking into the eyes of a Valorian commander was considered a challenge to his authority. For a child of an inferior species to do both at once was unthinkable. Commander Keth's face twisted with rage and disgust. "You dare address me, creature?" he hissed, and his hand moved to the plasma pistol at his hip. Lily did not understand the danger, and she tilted her head in confusion at the anger in his voice. "I just wanted to help," she said softly. Taking a small step backward, it was the last thing she ever said. The plasma bolt struck her in the chest before she could even scream, and her small body crumpled into the wheat like a broken doll biscuit began to howl. A long, terrible sound that echoed across the fields. But Commander Keth had already turned away. "Dispose of that noise," he ordered one of his soldiers, gesturing at the crying dog, and then he walked back toward his ship without another glance at what he had done to him. Nothing significant had occurred. He had simply removed an annoyance, like swatting an insect that had flown too close to his face. He did not file a report about the incident because there was nothing worth reporting an hour later. Marcus Chun found his daughter's body lying in the wheat, field with Biscuit whimpering beside her. The dog had bitten the soldier, who tried to kill him and escaped into the fields to guard his fallen friend. Marcus fell to his knees and gathered Lily into his arms. And the sound that came from his throat was not quite human. It was the sound of a father whose entire world had just been destroyed. A sound of grief so deep and raw that the farmers who heard it from miles away felt tears spring to their eyes without knowing why. He held her until the sun set and the stars came out. Those same stars that Lily had loved to watch from their porch while asking her father endless questions about what wonders might exist out there in the darkness. The Valorian patrol left New Eden the next morning. Completely unaware of what they had set in motion, they did not know that Marcus Chan had spent 15 years designing weapons capable of destroying starships. They did not know that he had friends scattered across human space who owed him favors and shared his skills. They did not know that every human who heard the story of Lily Chun would feel the same cold fury building in their hearts, and they certainly did not know the most important truth of all, that humanity was not the primitive, harmless species their databases claimed. Humanity had been hiding, watching, waiting, and preparing for the day when they would need to show the galaxy what they truly were. That day had finally arrived, brought forth by the murder of one small girl who had only wanted to help a stranger she thought was lost. The Valorian Empire had made countless mistakes in its long history, but killing Lily Chun would prove to be the last mistake they would ever make in the darkness of his empty home. Marcus Chen buried his grief deep inside his chest and began to make calls to old friends. The first spark of humanity's fire had been lit, and soon the entire galaxy would burn. The news of Lily Chun's death spread across human space like fire racing through dry grass. It started with a simple message from New Eden, just a few words describing what had happened to an innocent child at the hands of a Valorian commander within hours. That message had reached every human colony, every space station, and every ship traveling between the stars. People who had never met Lily Chun wept for her as if she had been their own daughter. The United Human Confederacy, the governing body that represented all of humanity among the stars, immediately sent a formal protest to the Valorian Empire, demanding justice for the murdered child. They requested an apology, punishment for Commander Zorvak's Keth, and assurances that such violence against human civilians would never happen again. The response they received shocked even those who had expected nothing. The Valorian Empire sent back a short message that contained only 3 sentences. The termination of an inferior juvenile does not warrant imperial attention, and no investigation will be conducted. And the human species is reminded of its place in the galactic order. When that message was broadcast across human networks, something changed in the hearts of billions of people. The sadness they had felt transformed into something harder and colder, something that burned like ice in their veins. Admiral Helena Vance watched the Valorian response from the bridge of her flagship, and her hands tightened into fists at her sides. She was 60 years old with gray hair cut short and eyes that had seen too many battles. And she had spent her entire career following orders and maintaining peace with species more powerful than humanity. But as she read those words dismissing the life of a child as worthless, she felt something inside her snap like a chain that had been holding back a flood. "They think we are nothing," she said quietly to her officers. And her voice was calm in a way that made everyone around her nervous. "They think they can kill our children, and we will simply accept it." She turned to face her crew, and every person on that bridge saw the fire burning behind her steady gaze. They are wrong, across human space. Similar scenes were playing out in boardrooms and government chambers and military bases. Corporate executives who had spent decades competing against each other suddenly began sharing resources and technology without asking for anything in return. Scientists from rival nations started working together on projects they had kept secret for years. Politicians who had argued endlessly about minor disputes now spoke with one voice. The old divisions that had separated humanity for so long simply melted away in the heat of their shared anger. Confederacy established what they called the Lily Protocol, a total mobilization of human civilization unlike anything that had come before. Every factory that could produce weapons began producing weapons. Every shipyard that could build warships began building warships. Every scientist who could improve human technology was given unlimited funding and told to work as fast as possible. But perhaps most importantly, the secrets that humanity had been keeping for generations were finally brought into the light. The galaxy believed that human technology was primitive, about a century behind the major powers like the Valorian Empire. This belief was not an accident. Humanity had deliberately hidden their true capabilities, showing the galaxy only what they wanted to be seen, while quietly developing weapons and ships that surpassed anything the Valorians possessed. They had learned from Earth's history that appearing weak could be a powerful advantage, and so they had played the role of the harmless newcomers while preparing for the day when they would need to reveal their true strength. The day had come at a terrible cost and secret. Laboratories scattered across human space. Engineers unveiled technologies that would have seemed like magic to the Valorians. Quantum slip drives that could move ships faster than anything in the galaxional field. Generators that could make Valorian weapons completely useless. Ohos-class warships that could strike from dimensions that Valorian sensors could not even detect. All of these wonders had been waiting in the darkness, and now they were being prepared for war. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen had vanished from New Eden. He left behind an empty house and a grave beneath the wheat fields where Lily had loved to play. And no one knew where he had gone. Intelligence agencies from a dozen human governments tried to track him, but Marcus had spent years building connections with people who operated in the shadows. Between civilizations, he had friends among smugglers and mercenaries and information brokers, people who owed him favors from his days as a military engineer. These friends helped him disappear into the vast darkness of space, and they asked no questions about what he planned to do. The Valorians remained completely unaware of the storm building against them. Their surveillance systems were designed to monitor species they considered threats, and humans had never been placed in that category. The algorithms that analyzed data from across the empire simply filtered out reports about human activity as irrelevant noise. When a few low-ranking analysts noticed unusual patterns in human shipping and communication, their superiors dismissed their concerns with contempt. "The humans are primitives," one Valorian intelligence officer declared at a briefing. "They pose no more threat to us than insects pose to a warship, and we have far more important matters to address than their pathetic attempts at protest." This arrogance was not unusual among the Valorian. She had ruled the galaxy for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to face a real challenge. 6 months passed while humanity Prepared in secret ships were built and crews were trained, weapons were tested, and strategies were planned. Admiral Vance assembled a fleet unlike any humanity had ever created, filled with vessels that incorporated every secret technology humanity possessed. She called it the First Retribution Fleet. And she personally selected every captain and every crew member based on one simple question. Were they willing to fight and die for a little girl they had never met? Every single person said yes on the other side of the galaxy. Commander Zorvax Keth continued his patrols without a care in the world. He had already forgotten about the human child he had killed. She had been nothing to him. Just another inferior creature that had annoyed him for a brief moment. He did not know that somewhere in the darkness between stars, a father was hunting him with patient, deadly determination. He did not know that the entire human species was preparing to teach the Valorian Empire a lesson it would never forget, and he did not know that his own death was already written in the stars, waiting for the moment when humanity would finally reveal the fire that had been burning in their hearts. The storm was gathering, and soon it would break upon the Valorian Empire with all the fury of a species that had been underestimated for the very last time. Commander Zorvax Keth's personal cruiser vanished without warning on what should have been a routine patrol. One moment it was traveling through hyperspace toward a distant Valorian outpost, and the next moment it simply ceased to exist on every scanner and tracking system in the Empire. No distress signal was sent, no wreckage was ever found. It was as if the ship had been swallowed by the darkness between stars. The Valorian military launched an investigation but found nothing useful, and most officers assumed that some kind of mechanical failure had destroyed the vessel. These things happen sometimes, even to the mighty ships of the Empire, but then another ship disappeared in almost exactly the same way, and then another, and then an entire supply convoy carrying enough resources to feed a dozen colonies. Fear began to spread through the Valorian Navy like a disease, and sailors started whispering about ghosts and curses and ancient powers awakening. In the void, they did not yet understand that something far more dangerous than ghosts was hunting them. Humanity had begun its war. The First Retribution Fleet emerged from hiding and struck at targets across Valorian space with terrifying precision. Admiral Vance had studied the Empire's defenses for months, and she knew exactly where to hit them to cause the maximum damage. Her ships did not attack military bases or population centers because that was not the goal. Instead, they targeted the infrastructure that held the Empire together, fuel depots that kept the Valorian Navy moving, communication relays that connected distant systems, shipyards that built new vessels, and trade routes that carried vital supplies. Every attack was perfectly planned and flawlessly executed. Human ships would appear out of nowhere, using technologies the Valorians could not understand, destroy their target in minutes, and then vanish back into the void before any response could arrive. The Valorians tried to fight back, but their weapons seemed useless against the human vessels. Plasma bolts that should have melted through any armor simply faded away when they struck human shields. Missiles that should have tracked their targets perfectly lost their guidance and flew off into empty space. It was as if the very laws of physics had turned against the Empire. After each attack, the humans left behind a message floating in space where the Valorians would find it. The message was always the same, a holographic image of a little girl with black braids and a bright smile, accompanied by 4 simple words that burned themselves into Valorian memory. You should have apologized. The image of Lily Chun became the most feared symbol in the galaxy, and Valorian commanders learned to dread the moment when that innocent face appeared on their screens. It meant that humanity had been there, and it meant that something important had been destroyed, and it meant that the Empire was growing weaker with each passing day. But while Admiral Vance waged her campaign of destruction against the Empire's infrastructure, another hunt was taking place in the shadows. Marcus Chun had found Commander Zorvax Keth. The Valorian officer had not actually died when his ship vanished because the ship had not been destroyed at all. It had been captured by a Centauri vessel that Marcus had built himself, using knowledge from his years as a military engineer. A ship so advanced that it could pull other vessels out of hyperspace and render them completely helpless. Keth and his crew had been taken prisoner before they even understood what was happening. Now the commander sat bound to a chair in a dark room somewhere in the depths of space, and across from him sat the father of the child he had murdered. Marcus did not look like a grieving parent. He looked calm and patient, like a man who had all the time in the universe and intended to use every second of it. "Do you remember her?" Marcus asked, and his voice was soft and steady. Keth stared at him with confusion and anger burning in his purple eyes. "Remember who, human?" he demanded, struggling against his bonds. "I have met thousands of your pathetic species, and I cannot be expected to remember every worthless creature that crossed my path." Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph, which he held up for Keth to see. It showed Lily sitting on a porch with Biscuit in her lap, laughing at something outside the frame. "Her name was Lily," Marcus said. "She was 8 years old, and she liked dogs and stars and running through wheat fields. And she wanted to be an explorer when she grew up, so she could see all the wonders the universe had to offer." He paused and watched Keth's face carefully. "You killed her because she asked if you were lost." Something flickered in Keth's eyes. A brief moment of recognition followed by dismissal. "The child on the farming colony," he said with a sneer. "I remember now, and I remember that she dared to address me directly, which was an insult that demanded punishment. And I would do it again without hesitation." Marcus nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the answer he had expected. "I thought you might say that," he replied. And then he began to tell Keth everything. About Lily, he talked about the day she was born and the way she used to laugh when he made funny faces. Talked about her first steps and her first words and the time she tried to adopt a stray cat that turned out to be a very confused raccoon. He talked about her dreams and her fears and her favorite foods, and the song she used to sing while helping him work in the fields. He talked for hours, and he made sure that Keth understood exactly who Lily Chun had been. Not just a random child, but a complete person with hopes and joys and a future that would never come. When Marcus was finally done talking, he activated a broadcast system that sent everything to every Valorian frequency in the sector. "Now the galaxy will see what your empire truly is," he told Keth. "They will see a commander of the great Valorian navy begging for mercy from a farmer whose only crime was loving his daughter." What happened next was broadcast live across half the boat. Galactic Valorian citizens watched in horror as one of their officers was broken. Not through violence, but through the simple, terrible weight of understanding what he had destroyed. Other species watched with grim satisfaction as the mighty Empire was humiliated before the stars, and humans watched with tears in their eyes, knowing that Lily Chun was finally getting the justice she deserved by the time the broadcast ended. The entire galaxy knew that humanity was no longer a species to be ignored. The lesson had begun, and the Valorian Empire was about to learn just how expensive their arrogance would prove to be. The Valorian Empire finally understood that it was facing a true threat after months of watching their infrastructure crumble and their officers humiliated before the galaxy. The Emperor himself ordered a full military response. 10,000 warships were assembled, the largest fleet the Empire had gathered in over 1,000 years. Billions of soldiers were mobilized from across Valorian space weapons that had been locked away in ancient Vaults were brought forth and prepared for battle. The Empire intended to crush humanity so completely that no species would ever dare challenge them again. Emperor Malthus IX addressed his people in a broadcast that reached every corner of Valorian territory. These humans have forgotten their place in the natural order, he declared with cold fury in his glowing eyes. They have attacked our ships and destroyed our property and humiliated our officers. And for this, they will pay a price so terrible that their species will be remembered only as a warning to others. He promised that within a month, the human confederacy would be nothing but ash and memory. Admiral Helena Vance watched the Emperor's speech from the bridge of her flagship, which had been renamed Lily's Fury in honor of the girl whose death had started this war around her. Officers worked at their stations with calm efficiency, preparing for the battle that everyone knew was coming. They're sending everything they have, her tactical officer reported, displaying the Valorian fleet movements on a holographic map. 10,000 ships converging on the Arcturus Gate. The Arcturus Gate was a strategic choke point that controlled access to human space, and both sides knew that whoever held it would have a massive advantage. Vance studied the map for a long moment before turning to address her crew. They outnumber us 5-1, she said, and her voice carried clearly through the bridge. They have larger ships and more powerful weapons and 10,000 years of military tradition. She paused and looked at each of her officers in turn. But they are fighting to protect their pride. And we are fighting for something far more important. And that is why we are going to win. The Battle of Arcturus Gate began on a cold morning by human reckoning. The Valorian fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation. A wall of silver ships that stretched across the void like an endless tide of destruction. Against them stood the human fleet, smaller and seemingly outmatched. Their ships arranged in loose formations that the Valorians dismissed as amateurish. The Valorian commander opened communications and offered the humans one chance to surrender. Lay down your weapons and submit to Imperial justice, he commanded with absolute confidence. Perhaps the Emperor will show mercy and allow some of your species to survive as servants. Admiral Vance's response was brief. Her name was Lily Chun, and she was 8 years old. Then she gave the order to attack. What followed was unlike any battle the galaxy had ever seen. The human ships moved in ways that Valorian tactical computers could not predict, using their quantum slip drives to appear and disappear across the battlefield in patterns that seemed random but were actually carefully coordinated. Valorian weapons that should have destroyed everything they touched were neutralized by null field generators that bent the very fabric of Space Ghost-class warships struck from dimensions that Valorian sensors could not detect, appearing long enough to launch devastating attacks before vanishing back into the void. But it was not technology that truly won the battle. The Valorians had assumed that humans would fight like other species, carefully, rationally, with an eye towards survival and eventual negotiation. They were completely wrong. Human captains did things that no rational being would consider when their weapons failed. They rammed their ships directly into Valorian vessels, sacrificing themselves to destroy enemies many times their size when their reactors were damaged. Crews ejected the unstable cores directly into enemy formations, creating explosions that took out dozens of ships when all seemed lost. Commanders ordered final charges into the heart of the Valorian fleet, fighting until the very last moment and taking as many enemies with them as they could. The Valorians watched in growing horror as these seemingly insane tactics tore their fleet apart. They could not understand why humans would throw away their lives so willingly. They could not comprehend the cold fury that drove every human soldier to fight without any thought of surrender. Of Valorian admiral sent a message to the human fleet asking why they were fighting so hard for one dead child. The response came from a human captain whose ship was already crippled and burning. A man who knew he had only minutes to live, because she was ours, he said simply. And you do not touch what is ours. Then he drove his dying vessel directly into the Valorian flagship's engine core. The explosion was visible from a dozen light years away by the time the battle ended. The Valorian armada had been broken beyond repair. More than half their ships were destroyed, and most of the survivors were too damaged to continue fighting. The human fleet had suffered terrible losses as well, but they had won a victory that would be remembered for as long as the stars continued to burn. And they were not finished. News of the Battle of Arcturus Gates spread across the galaxy at the speed of light. Other species watched the recordings with amazement and growing hope. Species that had suffered under Valorian rule for centuries and had long since given up any dream of freedom if the humans could fight back. They whispered to each other, then why could they not do the same? The rebellions began within weeks on 100 worlds. Oppressed species rose up against their Valorian masters. Inspired by the humans' example and armed with weapons that mysteriously appeared from unknown sources, the empire that had stood for 10,000 years began to crack and crumble as fires of revolution spread across its territory. Admiral Vance gathered the survivors of her fleet and prepared for the final phase of the war. They had broken the Valorian military and inspired a galaxy-wide uprising. Now it was time to finish what Lily Chun's death had started. Set course for Valoria Prime, she ordered, and her crew obeyed without hesitation. The homeworld of the Empire itself was about to receive a visit from humanity, and the Emperor would learn that some crimes could never be forgiven. 1 year had passed since a Valorian commander killed an 8-year-old girl on a small farming colony. 1 year of war and destruction and terrible losses on both sides. 1 year that had transformed the galaxy in ways that no one could have predicted. Now, Admiral Helena Vance stood on the vice bridge of Lily's Fury and watched Valoria Prime grow larger in the viewscreen. Throne world of the Empire hung in space like a jewel of silver and purple, its orbital stations and defense platforms forming rings around the planet that should have been impossible to penetrate. But those defenses were silent now. The Valorian Navy existed only as debris fields scattered across 100 star systems. The Empire's vassal species had risen in rebellion everywhere, and Valorian forces were spread too thin to respond. Economy that had sustained 10,000 years of conquest had collapsed under the weight of humanity's systematic destruction. Emperor Malthus IX had no choice left but to negotiate. The meeting took place in the Imperial Palace, a structure so vast that entire cities could have fit inside its halls. The Emperor sat upon a throne carved from a single massive crystal, surrounded by advisors and guards who watched the human delegation. With barely concealed hatred, Admiral Vance walked toward the throne with Marcus Chun at her side. He had emerged from the shadows to join the final campaign, and he had insisted on being present for this moment. The treaty terms had already been agreed upon through intermediaries. The Valorians would surrender all military assets beyond what was needed for basic defense. They would pay reparations to every species they had wronged during their 10,000 years of empire. They would recognize human space as completely off-limits to Valorian vessels without explicit permission. There would be trials for war criminals, including every officer involved in atrocities against civilians. The Emperor agreed to everything with a face like carved stone, showing no emotion as he signed away the power his ancestors had built over millennia. But the humans demanded one thing more, something that was not about military advantage or economic gain. "You will build a monument," Admiral Vance said, and her voice echoed through the vast throne room. In the central square of your capital city, where your people gather to celebrate victories and honor heroes, she held up a small holographic device that projected an image into the air. It showed a little girl with black braids and bright eyes, laughing at something beyond the edge of the frame. "This is Lily Chun," Vance continued. "She was 8 years old when your commander Zorvax Keth killed her for the crime of asking a question." The Emperor's advisors shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to interrupt. "You will build a statue of her, and you will place it among the monuments to your greatest emperors and conquerors. And every child born on this world will learn her name for the first time." Something cracked in the Emperor's composure. "You ask us to honor a human child in our most sacred place?" he demanded, his voice trembling with anger and disbelief. "This is an insult beyond measure." Marcus Chun stepped forward, and when he spoke, his voice was soft but carried clearly through the silent chamber. "It is not an insult," he said, meeting the Emperor's gaze without flinching. "It is a reminder." He paused and looked around at the assembled Valorians. "Your people need to understand what happens when they harm the innocent. And they need to remember this lesson for the next 10,000 years so that nothing like this ever happens again." The Emperor stared at Marcus for a long moment, and something passed between them that went beyond words finally. The ancient ruler bowed his head in acceptance. 1 month later, the monument was unveiled in a ceremony broadcast across the entire galaxy. Millions of beings watched as a simple stone statue was placed in the heart of Valorian power, showing a human girl looking up at the stars with wonder in her eyes. The Pota inscription at the base was written in every language known to the galaxy. It read, "Lily Chun, beloved daughter, whose life mattered." Admiral Vance addressed the gathered crowds and the billions watching from across the stars. "We are not conquerors," she declared, and her voice carried the weight of everything humanity had sacrificed to reach this moment. "We do not want your worlds or your resources or your submission." She gestured toward the statue of Lily. "We want you to understand one simple truth that your empire forgot in all your years of power. Every life has value, and every person matters, no matter how small or weak they might seem." She paused and looked directly into the recording drones that were broadcasting her words across the galaxy. "Harm one of us, the smallest or the weakest or the most seemingly insignificant, and you face all of us, because that is what it means to be human." The crowd was utterly silent as she continued, "Let this be the lesson you teach your children for the next 10,000 years, because we will never forget what was done to Lily Chun. And we will never forgive. And if anyone ever makes this mistake again, they will learn the same lesson you have learned." As the ceremony ended and the crowds began to disperse, Marcus Chun stood alone before his daughter's statue. The war was over, justice had been served, but Lily was still gone, and no amount of victory could bring her back. He reached out and touched the cold stone face of the statue. And for the first time since he had found her body in the wheat field, he allowed himself to weep. Admiral Vance found him. There, as the sun set over the alien city, she stood beside him in silence for a long time before finally speaking. "The galaxy has many names for us now," she said quietly. "Some call us the ones you do not provoke, and others call us the species that broke an empire." She looked at the statue of Lily, bathed in the golden light of the dying day. "But I think the name that matters most is the one we call ourselves. The people who will burn the stars themselves before letting someone hurt our children." Marcus nodded slowly and wiped the tears from his face. "She would have loved this," he whispered. "Seeing all these aliens, all these strange new worlds, all the wonders of the galaxy." He managed a small, sad smile. "She always wanted to be an explorer." Vance put a hand on his shoulder. "Then that is how we will remember her. Not just as the girl whose death started a war, But as the child who dreamed of seeing the stars, they stood together in the fading light, two humans on an alien world, looking up at a statue that would stand for thousands of years, and somewhere out among those stars, the story of Lily Chun was being told and retold by countless species who had found hope in humanity's example she and wanted to see all the wonders the universe had to offer in the end. She had become one of those wonders herself, a symbol of love and loss and the fierce, protective fury that lived in the heart of every human being. The galaxy would never forget her, and that was exactly as it should be.